So in this video, we're going to talk about the environment and specifically moral issues around and about the environment. We're going to look at arguments that make the case for our obligations to the environment and arguments that make the case that some actions are permissible towards the environment. So the first argument we're going to look at is the Kantian argument about moral standing. It goes like this. You are a member of the moral community if and only if you are rational and autonomous. Only humans are rational and autonomous. Therefore, only humans are members of the moral community. Only humans are morally important in their own right. So this argument is important when considering issues about the environment because it specifies what is important in a moral consideration. According to the conclusion, only humans are important because they're rational and autonomous. Other things are not important. So the environment is not important in its own right. The environment would be important only to the extent that it is for us humans. So this argument allows us to take actions as humans that use the environment in ways that we see fit to the extent that those uses are consistent with our status as humans as members of a moral community. So what are some ways to perhaps counter this argument? So the first way to counter the argument about moral standing is to say, it is not the case that you are a member of the moral community if and only if you are rational and autonomous. So, if we believe this, maybe some members of the moral community are irrational and not autonomous. Maybe animals are part of the moral community. Maybe plants are. Maybe even mountains and rivers are. If we allow ourselves to include things other than humans, things other than rational and autonomous beings, that is, then we might include the whole environment as part of our moral community. And then we have obligations towards the environment, just like we have obligations towards rational and autonomous beings like humans. The second way we might counter is we might say that non-humans are rational and autonomous. So we might think that there are some rational and autonomous animals. Perhaps great apes are candidates for such animals, maybe dolphins as well. We also might propose something more radical here. We might suggest something like a Gaia theory, which supposes that the planet itself is in some sense an organism, and that planet-wide organism could be rational and autonomous. If we did this, then we would have to include that entire environment as part of what we consider rational and autonomous, and then we would consider that part of our moral community. So if we accept either of these counters, then we reject the Kantian argument about moral standing. The next argument is the contractarian argument about moral standing. So this argument is similar to the Kantian, but from the perspective of social contract theory. So it goes, you are a member of the moral community if and only if you are able to enter into reciprocal agreements that promise to benefit those who have harmed you, benefit those who have benefited you, and to harm those who have harmed you. Only humans are able to enter into such reciprocal agreements. Therefore, only humans are members of the moral community. So this has a similar conclusion to the Kantian argument. with similar implications for considerations of the environment. So how do we counter this argument about moral standing? The first thing is we could say that it is not the case that you are a member of the moral community if and only if you are able to enter into reciprocal agreements. So maybe we include things in the moral community that don't have the capacity for entering into these agreements. And it seems like, in fact, we do. We often consider children to be part of the moral community, even though children don't have this capacity necessarily, especially babies. We even consider our pets part of the moral community. And we give rights that extend beyond the mere human person. We make stipulations about how to treat things in the world. So we may reject this first premise based on some of these counterexamples. The second thing we can do is we can say that non-humans are able to enter into such reciprocal agreements. So this is certainly true of some animals. It seems like some animals practice tit-for-tat behavior, which is to say that if they help each other, or if one animal helps the other, then the other animal helps the first animal back. Or if one harms the other, then the other will harm the first one back. It seems like the entire ecosystem is a kind of channeling of harms and benefits from organisms to other organisms in a way that one might call a kind of tit-for-tat community. Now, this doesn't mean all these animals have agreed to it. They've only participated in it to the extent that they were born into it. But if you are willing to stretch your conception of a reciprocal agreement, then you might be able to include the environment into that. We give to the environment, and in turn the environment gives back to us, is a way we could look at it. And even though the environment hasn't made an explicit agreement with us about that, by our more broad concept of reciprocal agreement, perhaps we could say the environment did. So if you like either of these counters, then you could reject the contrarian argument about moral standing. The next argument is similar as well. It's the utilitarian argument about moral standing, which is the same argument but framed from a utilitarian perspective. So it goes, a being is a member of the moral community if and only if it can experience pleasure or pain. Almost every human being and most non-human animals can experience pleasure or pain. Nothing else can experience pleasure or pain. Therefore, almost every human being and most non-human animals are members of the moral community. Nothing else is. So like the Kantian and contractarian arguments, this argument gives us the same conclusion, but is inclusive of non-human animals. So that's a slightly wider moral community than the Kantian and contractarian moral communities. However, this moral community does not extend to non-animals. So things like plants, things like oceans, things that are inanimate like rocks, they would not be included in the moral community. So we would not include the entire environment. We would just include the part of the environment that is animate. Now, we would want to consider the environment to the extent that it affects all of these animals, but we would be respecting the environment only to that extent. So with respect to the fact that the environment is required for animals to exist in it. So how might we reject this argument about moral standing? First, we might say that it is not the case that a being is a member of the moral community if and only if it can experience pleasure and pain. We might say that things that don't experience pleasure and pain should be included. Maybe there are certain kinds of people who have neurological disorders that make it impossible for them to feel pleasure and pain. Maybe we should include them. Or maybe we should include trees and other plants. Plants, it doesn't seem feel a pleasure or pain because they don't have a nervous system. But maybe they should be included because they also are part of our ecosystem and therefore part of our moral community and part of our consideration. Second, we could say not almost every human being and not most non-human animals can experience pleasure and pain. So this would be to reject that animals, for the most part, have these sensations. This seems like most probably an implausible claim, but we can attempt to make something like this claim if we take seriously the idea that maybe these things that we call sensations and these things that we call emotions, maybe these are just illusions, and maybe there is really no such experience. All experiences like this are just illusions. This is a tough sell because you would have to accept a theory of mind that made all experiences illusions, and then you'd have to suggest that they don't in fact experience anything because they're all illusions. But some philosophers have attempted these kinds of theories to varying success. Third, you could say other beings can experience pleasure and pain. So as implausible as it seems, some theories propose that trees and other plants might actually be conscious and might actually have sensations like pleasures and pains. If that's the case, when you're picking leaves or chopping down a tree or something like that, you're in a sense torturing it. There are even other theories that suggest that everything in the universe is conscious. This kind of theory is called panpsychism, usually, and under that theory, everything could conceivably have an experience, maybe not of pleasure and pain, but even perhaps pleasure and pain. So this would suggest something similar to a Gaia theory, where the environment itself is having experiences, and we can cause it pleasure and cause it pain depending on what we do. So if we accept any of these counters, then we reject this argument about moral standing. So moving past arguments of moral standing, we'll talk about the biocentrism argument. So this argument is somewhat different from the others. It goes, something has independent moral importance if and only if it is alive. Plants and animals are alive. Therefore, plants and animals have independent moral importance. So the similarity here is that we are trying to isolate the category of moral importance, just like the moral standing arguments. Though we're including things that we wouldn't usually call part of our moral community, because we're including everything that's alive. So, unlike the moral standing arguments where humans are at the front and center, the biocentrism argument essentially is inclusive of all living organisms on planet Earth. So, we should consider the environment to the extent that we are considering all living organisms on planet Earth. So what are some ways to counter the biocentrism argument. The first thing that we could say is that it is not the case that something has independent moral importance if and only if it's alive. We could give a counterexample here. For example, we could say that bacteria are alive, but we do not typically think that bacteria are of any moral importance. Some people may think that bacteria are of moral importance, but that's a fairly rare stance to take. And even in the wording of this argument, we don't include bacteria, even though they're alive technically. We just include plants and animals. We don't include non-plant, non-animal species, which would include bacteria. We could also make the claim that, secondly, we could make the claim that plants and animals are not alive. Now making this claim seems implausible on face value because it just seems to be part and parcel with the definition of life. Plants and animals are just part of the taxonomy of living things. So it seems just definitionally true that plants and animals are alive. It also seems like it's true that some plants and animals are dead and so are not alive. They're just the corpses of plants and animals. But in these cases, we wouldn't say, oh, those plants and animals' corpses are alive. We would specify, no, those are the dead corpses of something that once was alive. So we can't even really escape in that direction to make some kind of claim like this. The only way to make a claim like this, it would seem, is to sort of make some kind of suggestion that really nothing is alive, like everything is just dead matter. But this would be seemingly to change the commonly held definition of what living means beyond what people would reasonably accept as a definition. So this doesn't seem like a very good way to counter. So it seems like the best way would be to counter premise one. If you were to counter either premise, though, you could reject the biocentrism argument. The next argument is called the last person argument, and it goes like this. If the natural environment lacked intrinsic value, then it would be morally okay for the last person on Earth to destroy it. That wouldn't be morally okay. Therefore, the natural environment possesses intrinsic value. So this argument is essentially an interesting thought experiment. They're asking us to imagine being the last person on Earth and then destroying the Earth. Would that be okay? We can imagine perhaps some such situation. Let's say there's an apocalypse and everybody dies and you just happen to be the last one left. And also, you happen to be in a bunker with the nuclear codes. So even though everyone else, let's say is dead of a plague, you could basically finish off the Earth by launching the nukes and blow it all up. Would it be okay to do this? Now, you're not killing any humans by doing it, but you would be destroying the Earth. Does it matter that the Earth is destroyed, though, if there are no humans to consider that it matters that it's destroyed? Is the basic question. And the intuition that the argument gives us is that it wouldn't be okay. Don't launch those nukes. Even if you're the last person, just don't do it. There's still something valuable about the Earth without any people on it. So is there any way to counter this? So we could do two things. The first thing we could say is the natural environment lacked intrinsic value. That's true. But it would not be morally okay for the last person on Earth to destroy it. So why might this be the case? So the environment's meaningless without us, and we're gone. So then why couldn't we destroy it? Well, maybe we would keep the world. Maybe we should keep the world just in case it gets repopulated again, let's say. Let's say some monkeys survived, and those monkeys evolve into humans, and then there's a whole new race of humans bred from those monkeys, and they go on to value the Earth just like we did. Or, alternatively, there could be another planet with aliens. Those aliens could come, find the Earth, and then they could use the Earth and inhabit the Earth just like we humans did. So maybe the environment is instrumentally valuable, and that's why it would not be okay to destroy it. So that would be to reject premise 1. The other thing we could do is reject premise 2. So that would be the second thing. We would just say it would be morally okay to destroy the Earth. If you're the last person, go ahead, launch all of the nukes. This would be to bite the bullet and just say, no, there's no morality to speak of there. There's nothing we should or should not do. There's just a last person who's going to live their last days, and once their last days are over, then the universe just goes on in darkness because there's no humans there to see it. And so, because the universe has no humans to see it, what does it matter if we destroy it? That would be to bite the bullet on that. So you could say that, and that would be to reject the intuition of the argument. But you could reject that intuition, right? You could just say no. A universe with no humans has no value. End of story. So that's a potential suggestion, and if you were to reject premise 2 or premise 1, either way, you could reject the last person argument. Next, we have the no difference argument, and it goes like this. You are morally required to change your behavior or refrain from doing something only if that would improve the situation. Changing or refraining from your ordinary consumer practices would not improve the environmental situation. Therefore, you are not morally required to change or refrain from your ordinary consumer practices in order to improve the environmental situation. So this argument, the no difference argument, relates more directly to the environment because it's actually attempting to address our actual behavior and the way our actual behavior is affecting the problems in the environment. And the conclusion, though, is that basically we don't have to do anything. We don't have to protect the environment. The reasoning is that it would be ineffective, basically. Even if we changed, it would not affect the situation. It basically is like saying, well, I could stop polluting, but if I did, I would just be one person. It wouldn't make a difference because everyone else would still be polluting. Therefore, I'm not morally required to stop polluting. I can just keep polluting just like everyone else is. Okay, so what are some counters we might run against this argument? So the first counter is we might say, you are not morally required to change your behavior or refrain from doing something only if that would improve the situation. So here we're saying maybe, like we're accepting that, no, we're not going to make things better, really. Things are going to be pretty much just as bad. There's going to be just as much pollution. I'm just a drop in the bucket compared to the whole world. But that doesn't matter. I still shouldn't pollute, even though I won't improve the situation. Maybe by not polluting, I'm showing a good example to other people. Or maybe by not polluting, I'm just behaving in the Kantian way. I'm only doing something that could be universalizable without regard to improvement. Those could be ways to reject premise one. Secondly, we could say changing or refraining from our ordinary consumer practices would improve the environmental situation. So if we were going to say this, we would say that, even though your pollution is only a drop in the bucket, that drop in the bucket still is contributing to the environmental problem. The reason there's a problem is because a billion people are all polluting at the same time. If you stopped, then you could stop contributing. So the number of pollution contributors would go down by 1. And so the amount of pollution in the world would go down just a little bit. It wouldn't be much, but it would still be something. It's also true that if everybody stopped polluting at the same time, then it would improve the environmental situation. So that just seems simply true, because if the pollution's coming from everybody's a contributor, and everybody stops, then the problem stops. Now, it could be very difficult to get everybody in the world to stop polluting. That's a massive coordination problem, because you basically have to go to every single person and make sure that every person is not doing the bad thing. Extremely difficult. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not possible, and just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. So, if you accept either of these counters, you could reject the no difference argument.